Pressure. It can bring out the best in all of us, or leave us picking up the pieces after we've crumbled. Athalia Ponsell Lindsley was familiar with pressure. Born July 25th, 1917 in Toledo, Ohio, Athalia was a young beauty. She worked as a game show host on Winner Take All, as well as doing work on Broadway and modeling for various magazine ads. Athalia had once been engaged to Joseph Kennedy. However, by the time she reached her 30s, Athalia was cast aside, and with few other options, she decided to move with her ailing mother Margarita Gardner to St. Augustine, Florida, a city which had served as the site of many of her most cherished childhood memories.
Back then, maybe an exaggeration, everybody knew everybody or thought they knew everybody.
Indeed, when she came back, she would find love, marrying the former mayor, Jinx Lindsley, and although they would have a contentious relationship after their marriage, it was clear, then and now, that they loved each other. A little ways down from 124 Marine Street, Athalia's home, Francis Bemis lived at 144 Marine Street. The neighbors would become quick friends.
When I was younger, I had a paper out in that neighborhood, so I knew who Mrs. Bemis was. She lived on Marine Street, 4 or 5 doors down from the Stanford's house, and she used to walk a lot. I used to see her. Hi, Mrs. Bemis, how are you doing?
Frances, a known feminist and fashion writer, would have certainly encouraged Athalia to speak her mind in local matters. She, too, was a woman who didn't know her place. St. Augustine itself was a city under pressure. The residents had no time for a rabble-rousing now.
In the 70s, it wasn't too bad. The 60s, it was real bad. You know, with the demonstration, integration, and stuff like that. It was real bad then, but in the 70s, that cooled down a little bit. It was a lot better than it was in the 60s.
This brought her into conflict with her next-door neighbors, the Stanfords, and their patriarch, Allen Griffin Stanford, Jr.
Correct or otherwise, it's my understanding it all started over the 2 dogs on either side of her. But I don't think the Stanford's dog ran loose. I think they had a fenced-in yard. Maybe it was barking, I don't know, but it was something about dogs. And she started stirring up trouble, claiming he didn't have the proper degree that you have to get that job, and he was taking some classes to get himself, for lack of a better word, certified to have the credentials to be a county manager. And she, again, supposedly was raising a ruckus with the county that man isn't qualified to have this job because he doesn't have this degree or this certification or something like that. And the theory was, well, that's what got him stirred up, that she was trying to rob him of his job, so he went and took care of business on his own. I mean, that was, progressed into that in people's thinking, but something about her raising a ruckus with the county about him not being qualified to have that job.
She brought it up at city council meetings, but was dismissed. So her next step was to bring it to the attention to the State Board of Certification. This they were interested in, and they came down to visit Mr. Stanford to let him know that he was going to be investigated.
The fact that it occurred on Marine Street at the time, it's still a heavily traveled residential road, but it was much more heavily traveled at the time because Flagler Hospital was on the road. And so lots of hospital traffic that went in front of this house, and the fact that it occurs at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a busy street in the front yard.
On January 23rd, 1974, Athalia was preparing to walk her bird when she was confronted and attacked by a machete-wielding assailant. Athalia was mercilessly slashed with the machete until she lay dead on her front steps, her bird in pieces. The initial police investigation was marred by controversy. The choice to wash the blood off the front steps with a hose was particularly odious to those who investigated it later. There was only one witness to the crime, the neighbor across the street. 18-year-old Locke McCormick had heard noises out his front window and looked out. He called to his mother, "Mr. Stanford is hitting Miss Ponsell."
I actually had, in some sense, more empathy for Locke McCormick because he again was part of our larger friend group, and he was the only eyewitness, and so he was thrust into the limelight, and I think we all had a sense of what an awkward, difficult, scary position that was for him.
I never talked to him. I suspect it had to have been. I mean, he was, I think he was dating one of the daughters at the time. Her name was Pat. We called her Pat or Patty, and I believe they dated for a period of time, and they may have been dating when that happened. So that it had to have been. It was rough on his family. That I know, very rough.
A few weeks later, Alan Griffin Stanford Jr. was arrested for murder. Following his arrest, several key pieces of evidence were found in the nearby San Sebastian River. A pair of pants and a shirt which had been purchased by Mr. Stanford's wife, a machete, as well as a recently serviced wristwatch. The jeweler reported that he had fixed the watch for Alan Griffin Stanford Jr. All of these items were stained with blood.
It's actually, Dad's involvement was very small. It was my Uncle Frank. So my grandfather had two sons. They were both lawyers. So Uncle Frank was much more intimately involved than my dad was. When Mr. Stanford was charged with the murder, he initially retained my Uncle Frank to represent him in the murder. And they in turn associated two attorneys in Jacksonville that were very prominent trial lawyers. And so he assisted in Mr. Stanford's defense.
At the trial, the defense alleged that the chief of police, as well as the private citizen who had discovered the items, were conspiring to frame Stanford for the murder, saying the murderer was her husband, Jinx Lindsley.
My father and uncle saw James Lindsley, Jinx Lindsley was his nickname, on the street about the same time that the murder was occurring. So in some sense, they became alibi witnesses for Mr. Lindsley. Whenever there's a murder like this, you always look at the spouse first. So he was the initial suspect. But both of them could vouch that they had seen him on the street, and of course I'm sure others could do the same thing. So he was quickly able to explain where he was and his non-involvement, and he was never a serious suspect to my knowledge.
There was nobody who could place Alan anywhere, except for Locke McCormick, who said he was there at the scene of the crime. However, at trial, Locke recanted, saying he was uncertain of whether or not he had seen Mr. Stanford, as he had only seen the man from behind. There was more carnage during the trial. Frances Bemis claimed that she was writing a book detailing the case, and that she was going to have it published nationwide to bring attention to the small-town murder. She was found dead. Her head had been crushed by a brick. The police never formally connected the two crimes. At the end of Athalia's murder trial, the jury sequestered itself for only 2 hours before finding Stanford not guilty. Stanford walked out of the courthouse a free man. He would shortly thereafter move away from St. Augustine. It has now been almost 50 years since the murder, and still, it has never officially been solved.
I don't associate any difference because of the murder. I think the murder is a curiosity, but it's not like there were social implications to it, at least not in my opinion. If it had been racially motivated, if there was some other social implication to it, then I think there would have been an impact. But this was a high-profile crime, and again, other than that, I don't think there's anything more to it.
This is the book of Revelation. I do believe that we're living in. It's bad. Mothers killing their kids, the kids killing their parents and everything. So I don't, that wasn't surprising. It wasn't. And anything that happened nowadays, to me, is not a surprise.